Hello everyone, this is the fifth answer writing session related to environment and disaster management of our UPSC mains course. In the previous 4 sessions, we had tackled questions related to environment. In this session and the next session, we'll be tackling questions related to disaster management. In today's class, we'll be discussing disaster management in general. In the next class, in the last class, we'll be discussing the questions specific to certain disasters. So let us move to our first question. Holistic disaster management requires us to focus not only on post-disaster phase but also on the crucial pre-disaster phase. Now, over the period of time, there has been a change in the emphasis. Earlier, when we used to think about disaster management, it was basically response and relief activities after a disaster had struck. But now, over the period of time, like I said earlier, there is an increasing emphasis on the pre-disaster phase as well. And this has been highlighted not only in the Sendai framework for the disaster risk reduction, that's the global framework arrangement dealing with the disaster management, but also in our national disaster management plan and policy. So why, like what are the things that are included in the pre-disaster phase, post-disaster phase, and how can they go a long way in ensuring resilience from the disasters? If we talk about the pre-disaster phase, now it includes activities or strategies like prevention, mitigation and preparedness. Prevention, if we can adopt certain measures that with the help of which we can prevent disasters in the first place. Now, goes without saying that certain natural disasters, especially the natural disasters, they cannot be prevented. An earthquake will happen when it will happen, and there is not much that you can do anything to prevent it. But that's not the case with the man-made disasters. For example, let's say a nuclear disaster. Now, you can take steps to prevent such disasters in the first place. That the proper structural norms were followed or not. Are there proper operational checks? Are the standard operating procedures being followed? Are the safety protocols being adhered to? So, adopting these strategies, we can prevent disasters in the first place. How good it is if there are no disasters in first place. Then we have the mitigation. Now, mitigation is reducing the impact of the disaster. Adopting such strategies that reduce the impact, that reduce the potency of the disaster. Like I mentioned earlier, natural disasters, some natural disasters, they cannot be prevented. An earthquake, it will happen when it will happen. A flood, let's say, no doubt we can adopt strategies to, let's say, reduce the impact of flood. But otherwise, if a flood occurs, if a flood has already, let's say, occurred, like what strategy should we adopt in the pre-disaster phase that the impact of that flood is reduced, the impact of that earthquake is reduced, the potency of the disaster is reduced. There are the mitigation techniques or mitigation strategies. For example, let's say, like to give the example of earthquakes, you can adopt proper building codes and having such buildings which are resistant to earthquakes. Similarly, you can adopt certain other measures for other disasters. Now, these mitigation measures, they can be classified into 2 categories: the structural mitigation measures and the non-structural mitigation measures. The example I gave to you, it is in the context of structural mitigation measures. Non-structural mitigation measures would involve things like having risk insurance and financing, or simply moving to a safer area. If you are living in a area, in a region which is more prone to a particular disaster, if you would move to a safer area, that would also involve, that's also an example of non-structural mitigation strategy. That you are trying to save yourself from the impact of the disaster. That's what mitigation is. Then preparedness. Do we have the disaster management plans ready, emergency management plans ready? What are our strategies for restoration of the lifeline services like water supply, electricity supply? Do we have disaster specific plans ready? Do we have the disaster management teams ready? Mock drills, have we conducted the mock drills that prepares not only the disaster management teams, disaster response teams, but also the community vis-a-vis what steps are supposed to be undertaken when a disaster strikes? So the preparedness measures would support the response and relief activities during the disasters. These are the three things that we are supposed to do in the pre-disaster phase. So these will ensure that either disaster does not occur, we are able to prevent a man-made disaster, or even if the disaster strikes, its impact is mitigated and we are able to mount relief and response operations in a timely manner. Which brings us to the post-disaster phase. In the post-disaster phase, again, three sets of activities need to be undertaken. One is the response and relief activities. Then you have rehabilitation activities. And lastly, you have the reconstruction. Response is like that, something that is more like that comes very naturally to us when we think of disaster management. An earthquake has struck. What things are we supposed to do after a disaster has struck? Like the emergency operations mounted by the district level teams, state level teams, national disaster response teams, the evacuation of people, search and rescue missions that are mounted, emergency health services that are provided, all those things that are done immediately when the disaster strikes, those come under the category of response and relief activities. Now, after that, we need to rehabilitate people. We need to restore the socio-economic functions of the community. At least, if not fully, at least initially on a temporary basis. People need to be, after the people are rescued, they need to be moved to safe places. They need to be moved to proper housing facilities. They need to be provided with the services like water supply. They need to be provided with the sanitation services. So all these things, they are included in the rehabilitation activities, and more specifically physical rehabilitation activities. Then there is also economic rehabilitation, the restoration of the livelihood activities of the people. The disaster, it may have resulted in loss of livelihood to the people. So how the economic functions are restored. Psychosocial rehabilitation. Some people, they are so much traumatized by disaster, by the incidents of the disaster. So how they have to be incorporated back and how the social functions are to be restored. Reconstructions involves complete restoration of the social functions, like going to the pre-disaster stage, but with better strategies, but with an infrastructure that is now more capable of withstanding disasters in future. And to highlight this aspect, Sendai framework has given us a very beautiful phrase, BBB, build back better. That the reconstruction activities that are to be undertaken, they are to be undertaken in such a manner that now the buildings, now the structures, they are more resilient, they are more prepared, they are more resilience is the right word, more resilient to the impact of future disasters. So these are the things that need to be undertaken in the post-disaster phase. Both the phases are equally important. The pre-disaster phase, it prepares us to handle disaster if and when it strikes. The post-disaster phase, it helps us to recover in a more timely manner. and leads to restoration of the socio-economic and physical functions in as little time as possible. So in this way you can weave an answer to this question. Now we'll be moving to the next question. Discuss the desirability of disaster risk insurance and financing. Disaster risk insurance and financing in disaster management and planning, also highlighting the steps to be taken to actually incorporate this element into our disaster management strategies. Like while discussing mitigation in the previous question, I had mentioned that the non-structural mitigation measures would involve resorting to risk insurance and financing. Now, this particular question is specifically in the context of risk insurance and financing. Desirability of disaster risk insurance and financing. You see, invariably there is a gap vis-a-vis the funds available to tackle a disaster and the actual requirements of funds for proper recovery from a disaster. So how can we fill this gap? States or the central government as well, they have limited budgets at their disposal, but the requirement of funds for proper recovery is way more. So invariably what we do is that we start diverting our developmental funds for the disaster relief activities, or we resort to external assistance. External assistance, it may have its own cost, it may impose certain conditions that we may have to fulfill, and if we start diverting the developmental funds for the disaster response activities, we may have saved a day. But like you see, like what would be the long-term implications of such diversion of funds? Don't you think the development of the region would be impacted? The long-term development of the region would be impacted because of this diversion. So we need to fill in this gap. What's the best way to fill in this gap? That's the disaster risk insurance and financing. One more thing, like highlighting the desirability only. There are certain losses that are not covered by official reconstruction and rehabilitation activities of the state. The income loss that has occurred as a result of disaster, the livelihood loss that has happened as a result of disaster. Sometimes the official relief activities, relief and rehabilitation activities, they do not cover each and every of such aspects. So what we can do is, at the individual level also, we need to encourage risk insurance and financing, so that the impact of the disaster, at least the financial aspect of the disaster, is reduced. There is minimum economic loss and maximum economic recovery from a disaster if we resort to the risk insurance measures. Now, what are the steps? What are the steps that can be taken to incorporate this element? Now, steps can be divided into two categories: the steps that government needs to take and steps that individuals need to take. Now, governments, they must expand their contingency risk budgets. They can collaborate with the large public sector companies that can ensure the public assets and the critical infrastructure, whatever loss is caused to the public infrastructure, that thing at least should be financially covered through risk financing. So government should at least not worry about the funds that would be required for reconstruction of the public infrastructure destroyed as a result of disaster. Then government can incorporate, like make such rules that incentivize people to resort to risk financing. At the individual level, that the maximum personal assets, they should be insured depending on the disaster profile of the region. Like people should know what are the hazards, and against those hazards, what steps needed to be taken, what assets needs to be protected and insured. So individual, this thing should be promoted even at the individual level as well as at the government level. So similar steps can be taken to incorporate these strategies. So with this, I wrap the second question, and you can see much more points from the model answers provided. Next is, what do you understand by vulnerability? Discuss vulnerabilities of urban areas to disasters. what measures would you suggest to make cities more resilient? Now there are three things that are asked in this question. One is the basic understanding of the vulnerability, second, vulnerability of urban areas to disasters, and the third is the steps that can be taken to make cities more resilient. Now you can start with the basic definition of vulnerability. What is vulnerability? It is the diminished capacity of individuals as well as communities to anticipate, to cope up with, to resist, and to recover from the impact of the disaster. A disaster is expected to strike a particular region. So what is the if that community or if that region is more exposed to a certain disaster and is less capable of recovering from the impact of that disaster, then that region or that community is vulnerable to the impact of that disaster. So vulnerability is the diminished capacity of the individuals as well as communities to anticipate, cope with, resist and recover from the impact of the disaster. The question also introduces this term resilience, making cities more resilient. What is resilience? It is the increased capacity of individuals and the communities to cope up with the effect of the disaster, to recover from the impact of the disaster. The disaster has struck, but the city or the community has been able to recover from its impact in a relatively short time. Like in Punjabi we say teeth कि like disaster हुआ and बहुत जल्दी city ने या community ने recover कर लिया. That's resilient cities, resilient communities. So what is resilience? It is the increased capacity of the community or the individuals to recover from the impact of the disaster, so while specifically incorporating in recovery. Now you have to incorporate that the Sendai framework points also. While recovering, the cities are also adapting their structures so that they are more prepared to deal with the disasters in future in terms of long-term challenges and vulnerabilities. Now if we come to the second part of the question, vulnerability of urban areas to disasters. Why are urban areas, how are urban areas more vulnerable to disasters? One is urban areas, they have more concentrated housing. If we talk about the density of the population, that's the basic difference between the urban center and the rural center. Urban areas have a higher density of population. So irrespective of the disaster, like whatever disaster strikes in urban areas, it is invariably going to impact a larger number of individuals as compared to a rural area, because that has a lesser density of population. On the urban area, it has on the other hand, the urban area, it has the higher density of population, and the number of people that are going to be impacted by a disaster is in any case going to be way more as compared to rural area. And then unplanned urbanization, particularly the regions where the let's say the migrants from the low social economic strata settle, the kind of housing there is of very shabby quality. So those constructions, they may collapse on their own, and like their probability of collapse or destruction, it increases greatly in the event of the disaster. The structures collapsing on their own, that itself is a form of urban disaster. That a building has collapsed, leading to death of, let's say, like just to give a hypothetical example, a building in Mumbai collapsed and that led to death of 60 laborers. Now this in itself is a disaster. And the probability of such events happening as the result of a natural disaster, natural hazard like earthquake, flood, excessive rain, that greatly increases. shabby construction. Paved area, like cities invariably they are marked by much more percentage of paved area that prevents rainwater to discharge into the underground water to flow to the to discharge underground. That increases the probability of flooding. That increases the frequency and vulnerability to flooding, because the most of the area it is in an urban center it is paved, and there is this increasing tendency, like very saddening tendency, that we are trying to pave each and every open region on the city. Like I see pavements being paved over by like the sidewalks paved with the pavers or the interlocking tiles. Now that leads to the lesser space, that leaves lesser space for water to percolate to the ground. So that's another vulnerability, that's another way in which the urban areas are more vulnerable to instances of flooding. Over the period of time we are also seeing increasing instances of urban flooding. That is one reason that's responsible for it. Lastly, so many industries are set up in the vicinity of the urban areas, so the probability of the industrial disasters or the disasters, for example of the scale of Bhopal gas tragedy or gas leak in general, that is also more in case of urban areas as compared to rural area. That also increases the vulnerability of urban areas to urban disasters. So these are the vulnerabilities of the urban areas that you can mention in your answer. Now moving to the third part of the question, what measures would you suggest to make cities more resilient? How can we make cities more resilient, that they are able to cope up with the impact of the disaster? As far as the construction wala point was concerned, we should adhere to proper building codes. As far as so that the proper structural measures are in place and the construction is of good quality, and this thing includes retrofitting of the old dilapidated structure. Surveying and retrofitting of the old dilapidated structures. As far as the paved area is concerned, the point with respect to the increasing proportion of paved area is concerned, we should strictly adhere to zoning and land use planning codes. Zoning and land use planning codes. If certain area is earmarked for as a green space within a city, that thing must be adhered to. Parks, they must not be encroached upon and used as parking lots and such like things. So zoning and land use planning measures should be adhered to. All the industrial units within the city, they should have proper safety measures in place, and the standard operating procedures should be followed so that there is no industrial accident. Then we can also incorporate certain innovative techniques like specific urban financing in the form of disaster bonds or municipal bonds, the proceeds of which are used exclusively for disaster management purposes to make the cities more resilient. So these are the financing techniques that can be explored. Then we should always keep in mind the SDGs and the Sendai framework. That disaster, the aim should be to reduce the risk of the disaster. Now over the period of time there has been increasing emphasis on disaster risk reduction. Reduce the risk of the disaster, mitigate the impact of the disaster, prepare ourselves so that when a disaster strikes we are able to provide an effective response and we are able to build back better. So those things have to be incorporated into the urban governance structure also. and only then we can realize the vision of having inclusive, safe, resilient, sustainable cities, that is SDG 11. So in this way you can conclude this answer. So moving to the next question, the National Disaster Management Plan is devoid of many important elements that make a good and robust action plan. It may fulfill the formal requirement of a law having a plan, but it may not be effective in achieving its grandiose vision of building resilience. Evaluate. काफी भारी भरकम statement that our National Disaster Management Plan, it's there. It is fulfilling the basic requirements of the National Disaster Management Act, that we need to have a plan. But it is devoid of certain elements that make a good and a robust plan. And the statement says that because of that, the plan may not be effective in achieving its vision of building resilience. Now we are supposed to evaluate this statement. To what an extent is this statement true? What are the elements of our National Disaster Management Plan? Are they good enough? What are the shortcomings? And how can those shortcomings be addressed? So these will be weaving an answer around these points. Now you can start the answer to this question by mentioning that National Disaster Management Plan was introduced in 2016 and was updated in 2018. The primary aim of the plan is to make India disaster resilient. Now, some of the key features of this plan include that it is based on Sendai framework for disaster management, disaster risk reduction. The 4 thematic areas of which include understanding the disaster risk, improving the disaster risk governance. Then you have investing in disaster risk reduction through structural and non-structural measures, capacity development in the form of improved infrastructure, early warning systems, and preparedness. So our plan is based on the global Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It the good things about the plan include it has tried to vertically and horizontally integrate various agencies involved in disaster management, provides for plans up to village and urban municipality level. So there is a great deal of integration that is involved, integration of activities that is involved in the National Disaster Management Plans. Plus the plan also provides for a certain checklist to various agencies vis-a-vis various activities that are to be undertaken in the pre-disaster and the post-disaster phase. The evacuation plan, search and rescue mission, information dissemination, emergency health services, fuel, transportation, all those things. So agencies now have a checklist also as a result of the plan that these activities are to be taken care of. So these are some of the positive points with respect to the National Disaster Management Plan. Plus there are other points as well. For example, the plan follows a regional approach, which will help not only in adopting appropriate strategies at the local level, but they will also help the developmental process in general. Now, what are the loopholes in the plan? Like why the statement says that it may not be effective in achieving its vision of building resilience, bringing about disaster resilience. This is because the plan, the National Disaster Management Plan, it has it lacks a practical and clear roadmap. If you think about the activities that are mentioned in the National Disaster Management Plan, they are very generic activities. They are otherwise mentioned in the National Disaster Management Act as well. They are available in the policy as well. So nothing specific is mentioned. like the activities are not properly dovetailed. So very generic activities are mentioned which were known earlier as well. And not only that, they are like generic activities, just the generic activities are mentioned. Also no clear time frame is given that in what time frame those activities are to be done, and those targets, like targets are not mentioned in first place, and there is no time frame also. So time frame to achieve the targets or activities, time frame is missing. Then funds, the plan is silent about how the funds are to be arranged, how the funds are to be mobilized for the disaster management plan. Then the plan also lacks monitoring mechanism. There is no way we can monitor the progress of the plan, or evaluate the progress of the plan, or take the corrective steps. Like all these things would happen only if we have the clear roadmap. When there is no clear roadmap, there are no targets, there are like generic activities are mentioned, no time bound targets are given. So how would you be able to monitor the progress of the plan? So this is one thing. Then unlike Sendai framework, no specific goals have been mentioned, nor the plan mentions how the Sendai framework goals, to which India is signatory, to align the purpose of the plan was to align a disaster management strategy with the Sendai framework. So the plan is also silent about how the Sendai goals are going to be achieved. There is no time frame for achievement of the Sendai goals as well. So without these things, it will be difficult to achieve this vision of a disaster resilience. So you can conclude this answer in such a manner that like in the evaluate questions, it is required that you give your concluding remark. The plan is a comprehensive plan, but it lacks time frames, goals and targets which are required to achieve this target of disaster resilience. So in this way, you can give a conclusion to your answer. Now we move to the last question for the day. With reference to NDMA guidelines on crowd management, and discuss the measures to be adopted for effective management of large gatherings of people without causing a stampede. Now this is one question that I have taken with respect to a specific disaster, that is crowd management. That's also not a specific disaster, but like how we can manage the crowd at religious gatherings or such like functions, which invariably have the possibility of turning into a stampede, leading to loss of so many lives, leading to so much health cost. So what are the NDMA guidelines with respect to the crowd management, and what measures need to be adopted for effective management of the crowd? Now the key word over here is management of the crowd, not crowd control. How can we properly manage the crowd in case of such gathering? Now you can start the answer to this question by mentioning that recurring stampedes nudge the National Disaster Management Authority to formulate guidelines on crowd management. As per these guidelines, the planning of any event expected to attract large crowd should be based on 5 parameters. What are those 5 parameters? Type of event. Is it a religious event? Is it a political event? Is it organized by a school or a university? Is it a sports event, musical event? What kind of event it is? Then the type of crowd expected. What is the expected age group of the people who are expected to attend the event? What is the gender composition? What is the economic background? Are like let's say people belonging to a particular profession only supposed to attend the event, or is the event going to be attended by a mixed set of people? So what is the expected crowd? Then what are the expected crowd motives? Are we expecting that the people like who were invited to the event for that specific purpose, only those people are going to attend the event, or is there a possibility of other people also attending with the ulterior motives? Like, is there a possibility, or is there an expectation that miscreants may also attend the event and try to create ruckus? So we have to accordingly plan. So what are going to be the crowd motives? Then you have venue. Something is wrong. Venue. What's the location of the event? Is it is it going to be held on on private land or on public land or public property? What is going to be the topography of the region? Is the let's say the water facilities available, water easily available for the event? So this is yet another consideration that has to be taken into that should be considered as far as planning of a mass event is concerned. Then last is a role of other stakeholders. Who are the other stakeholders? I am organizing a mass event. Let's say I am an organization and I am willing to organize an event which is expected to generate large crowds. Local administration of the region, like if large crowds are expected to attend my event, there has to be like proper planning of the traffic routes as well, proper arrangements for parking as well, the neighboring people or let's say organizations. If I'm wherever I'm organizing the event, the people who are residing in the nearby areas, they are the stakeholders, so they have to be taken into consideration. So according to NDMA guidelines on crowd management, any planning of any event that is expected to attract large crowd should be based on these parameters. Now if I talk about the measures that can be adopted for effective management of large gatherings, again we'll be discussing these measures in reference to NDMA guidelines only. Like, what sort of measures can we adopt? Traffic management. Like I said earlier, if large number of people are expected to attend an event, what routes would they follow? Do we have the proper route map? Do we have the proper emergency exit points on the route map? Is that route map properly communicated to the people who are expected to join the event, as well as to the other people who may have to take an alternative route for their day-to-day activities? So traffic management is one thing. Then crowd management. That proper barricading is done to channelize people through the proper walking routes, and if there are still large number of people expected to let's say move into a particular direction, then snake line approach should be adopted while barricading. You might have experienced this snake line approach while attending while visiting some of the religious places, that people are supposed to move in snake barricades, because that strategy incorporates more number of people in less space. So crowd management. Then you have communications. CCTV cameras, they should be installed at multiple locations, at sensitive locations where the event is being organized. There should be proper public addressal system as well. There should be installation of loudspeakers or something like that, through which the management or the organizers, they can communicate with the people attending the event. Important announcements can be made, and it is here that the role of advanced technologies like GIS or space-based balloons can be also co-opted. GIS, remote sensing, such techniques can also be co-opted over here. And then the availability of medical facilities on the venue. proper emergency first aid treatment should be available. Healthcare professionals should be available on the venue only. Ambulances should be strategically placed that in case some unforeseen incident occurs, proper healthcare can be provided, health services can be provided. Then you can include the availability of basic services. The drinking water is available. Sanitation facilities are available. Authorized use of electricity, like with proper permission from the municipal authorities. So all these things is done so that the arrangement is not ad hoc and people have their basic needs served. So these are the things that should be taken care of. These are the measures that should be adopted for effective management of large gatherings of people. So in this way, you can write an answer to this question. With this, I'll conclude this session. So we have discussed 5 questions related to disaster management aspect. In tomorrow's class, we are going to discuss questions specifically related to certain disasters. So that's all as far as this session is concerned. Thank you from my side.